Hi there. My name's Mrs. Wrycraft, and today I'm going to talk to you about what is a tragedy anyway. So this would apply to you if you're studying GCSE English literature and you're studying Romeo and Juliet or Macbeth. If you're studying A-level, you're looking at Othello or A Streetcar Named Desire, and there are a whole host of other texts that are tragic. When I say tragic, I do not mean woeful in the way that a teenager might use the term tragic to refer to an adult's life, but actually tragedy in terms of ancient Greek and Roman theatre. So let's crack on, shall we? So we're going to think about the various definitions of tragedy. We're going to think about and learn where the roots of the form came from, and then finally I'm going to introduce you to the key terms that you need to make sure you work into any writing you might do in order to clearly demonstrate that you understand the English literature concept of tragedy. So let's crack on. Tragedia is from the ancient Greek and Latin. It exists in both, and it refers to a very specific form of drama. The drama contains a paradox in that it's a truth that's heightened by describing elements of its opposite nature. It often defines a cultural identity in that it takes one particular facet of a culture and shows how that culture creates unhappiness and effectively tragedy and sadness within the characters in the story that's being told, so in the characters within the narration. And of course it is the opposite to comedy. Tragedy has a sad ending, comedy has a happy ending. Comedies do not have to be funny to be comedic. Good job really, because a lot of Shakespeare's comedies don't make you laugh out loud very often. So Aristotle, ancient Greek philosopher, suggested that tragedy basically relies on the artist imitating an action that one might consider admirable, and something that possesses great qualities in terms of magnitude, so it's high impact. It uses pleasurable language, so language which people can understand and gain knowledge from, and is separated into different parts. It's performed by an actor, but it's not performed through narration, it's performed through show, not tell. So tragedy comes from the shared experience of a character on a stage or in a novel or in a play or a poem that you happen to be reading, and the audience or the reader themselves. The tragedy is created by the purification of negative emotions. Okay? That might not seem terribly easy to understand right now, but hopefully by the time we get to the end of this 15 minutes or so, you'll feel much better connection to it. So let's move on. So Aristotle said that for a tragedy to really work, it needs to have a unity of three elements. So it needs to have a unity of time, place, and action. That means that it needs to make sense, and the time and the setting and the events within that setting need to work together to create the tragedy. So if we think about one of the texts that a lot of people study, an Inspector Calls, it conforms to the three unities of a well-made piece of theatre, but it also has this unity of time, place and action, in that it happens in real time, it happens in one place, and the action is all relative to the tragic death of Eva Smith. So when we're thinking about a tragedy, we think about the time, place and action, and think about whether they unify to create a bigger effect for the audience or for the reader. We're reflecting on Macbeth, it's chronological. We do have leaps in time where some passage of time is obviously takes place between scenes. For example, after the death of Duncan and before the coronation of the Macbeths, there's obviously some amount of time, but that's glossed over in the pace of the play. But actually it follows sequentially. The places all make sense and they are all appropriate to the setting, and the action builds towards the end. And when we get to the actuality, when we get to the most important part of the play, that's where the action is at its most dominant. So that's what we're thinking. Okay? So there are things that need to be dealt with, and here are some of your key words here. So if you want to pause and write down some of these keywords after I've explained them, that might not be such a terrible thing to do. So Aristotle says that a tragedy always deals with someone who has a high status, either actually socially a high status, like a king in terms of Macbeth, or just plain somebody who is respected or very important to the story that is being told. So that person of high status falls into a misfortune because they have a flaw, because they have a character flaw. With Macbeth, I personally think it's because he's not particularly clever, but he's also really easily led by Lady Macbeth, and his ambition leads him to into a fatal mistake. When we're thinking about an Inspector Calls, we've got fatal mistakes on part of all of the Burlings and Gerald as well. So what we're looking at really is those characters making that fatal mistake. In Romeo and Juliet, there are lots of mistakes that catch us out, and each one of these fatal mistakes made by mostly Romeo, but occasionally Juliet and the friar and the nurse, all lead to this fall into misfortune, this hamartia, which is the fatal mistake or a flaw. What then happens is we have the peripeteia, where things look like they're going to go okay, but there is this terrible turn for the worse. So again, if we're thinking about Macbeth, we're thinking about the point at which he kills Banquo, he kills the Macduff family, and people in Scotland are starting to mistrust him. His grip on power is loosening significantly. In an Inspector Calls, we're looking at the reversal of fortune, when everybody realises that actually they have had a part to play in the death of Eva Smith. If you think about any of the sad stories that you've read, there's always a point at which it looks like everything's going to be okay, but then it really takes a tumble down. It's the climax of the action, but it's generally the low point for the hero of the piece. At this point, we have this agnoresis, where the main characters will recognise some very unfortunate truth. Again, if I use my example of Macbeth, we've got a character there who, in his speech, which starts with tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, he talks about how life is just a shadow. Ultimately, when it comes to it, things that we do in life mean nothing. He has this recognition that actually everything he's done has come for nothing. Kind of harks back to the bit at the beginning where he talks about for his own issue, he's got nothing, and Banquo's children will have it all. Finally, there's the catharsis, and the catharsis is important for the audience rather than for the characters. Very rarely do characters in a tragedy actually get this sense of satisfaction at the end, but the catharsis for the audience is this sense of relief at the end when the story is told, and a very small grain of hope for the future. Again, taking the example of Macbeth, this is held through Malcolm's speech at the end, where Malcolm is presenting himself as a good king of Scotland who is going to work with the English people to see that his country grows and is prosperous once again. If we think about Romeo and Juliet, the catharsis at the end of the story comes when the Capulets and Montagues find a way to get on. If we think about an Inspector Calls, we've got that speech the inspector gives about learning to look after each other, all the Eva and John Smiths of this world, and then at the very end, we've got the characters, particularly Averic and Sheila, who have recognised that they have this flaw and are going to do something about it. So if you think about all of the different tragedies that you know, generally at the end there's this sense of satisfaction for the audience. Now, the one that I teach that doesn't have this is A Streetcar Named Desire, because actually when we get to the end of A Streetcar Named Desire, a spoiler alert, fast forward for about 10 seconds if you don't want to know what happens, but when we get to the end of A Streetcar Named Desire, things are worse for the characters at the end than they were at the beginning, and there is no grain of hope for the future, particularly for Blanche and Stella. If you ever study that, it's a cracker, and you should definitely have a good read if you never get a chance to study it yourself. So Aristotle says that actually a decent tragedy always has catharsis, and catharsis for the audience is the goal of any tragic story. So it's to illustrate these horrible things that have happened and these really unfortunate things that have happened, and how people recognise their flaws, recognise these, kind of come to the understanding of this unwelcome truth, and then the audience realises that once people have been this honest with themselves, there is a grain of hope for the future. So it's generally accepted that in tragedy, someone who shows nobility and morality get their rewards. So Sheila and Eric in an Inspector Calls, having felt sorry for what happened to Eva Smith, learn that in the future, resolve to be better in the future. Whereas evil or immorality, we're thinking about the older Burlings here, they don't get rewarded, and actually their old ways are going to, as we well know, disappear in fire in the war that's coming. So in the Greek tradition, all these things that you can see on the screen in front of you were used in order to present a tragedy. There was chorus and music and dancing, and so on. And there was the Dionysa, which was all about public consumption. There was an awful lot of drinking and eating going on. And then it was accompanied by a satire or a satyricon play. All of these things surrounded the tragedy. So the tragedy was part of a much bigger set of performances. So although the Greek audience was learning from it, they were also being entertained by the music and choruses and the dancing and the choral poetry. It's when lots of people speak at the same time. There was also the Dionysa, which is basically a big indulgent party with food and drink, named after Dionysus, the god of wine and parties. And the Satyricon, which took the mickey mostly out of politics and philosophers and important people of the day, so soldiers and so on. The other thing to understand is that Greek tragedy or Greek plays in general is where we get the term Deus ex machina, which means the god in the machine. And this was because they used to attach their actors to the bottom of a very large lever and hoist them up into the air so that they could represent the gods hovering above the other actors who were walking around and performing on the stage. And often the gods would come in at the end of a tragedy and moralise and explain the lesson that the protagonist had to learn, or the antagonist even sometimes, or both had to learn. Three writers up there on the screen in blue are Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides, all worth having a little look at their Wikipedia pages just to understand a bit about the nature of the writing they did. Unless you're planning to study classics, I wouldn't recommend that you get out a complete works and give it a read, but reading some of the summaries of the work that they've written will really help you to understand the nature of tragedy from a Greek perspective. Next to that we have the Romans. Romans civilization came after the Greek civilization, so it's a little later in history but still BC, so before Christianity really. By the time the Roman Empire fell in AD 400, it had existed for many hundreds of years before that. Romans were very fond of long moralizing soliloquies where a character would explain exactly what was going on to the audience and explain their flaws and inwardly reflect. And this actually is very reflective of the strategy that Shakespeare uses with his main characters. Characters like Macbeth, characters like Othello have long soliloquies, and Hamlet as well actually have long soliloquies where they explore their inner feelings and their inner landscape. We've also got rhetoric, so the skill of persuasion and persuasive talk, narrative accounts of the action rather than actually action on stage. Because of the limits of Roman theatre, very much like Shakespeare again, you would get someone come on and say, and then 500 soldiers fought each other and only 2 were left standing, and so on. Roman theatre, unlike Greek theatre, was actually only meant for the elite. So the regular people didn't go to the theatre. They went to to see the gladiators fights and they went to the gladiatorial rings and the colosseums and so on in order to see the kind of shows of strength and physical games. A lot of the Roman stories, however, were adapted from those that you would see in the Greek play. So the stories, just in the same way as the pantheon of the gods are very reflective, the stories that the Romans tell in their plays are very reflective of the ones the Greeks took. And then finally, one thing that's much more prevalent in Roman tragedy than Greek tragedy is this idea of magic and supernatural forces getting involved, particularly the forces of the gods, and sometimes mystical forces as well. Someone to look up there is Seneca. Seneca, we know, had a big influence on Shakespeare, so a little read of his stuff, not such a bad thing to do at all. Finally, the background to the Renaissance. So we've got Petrarch, who you might be familiar with as a writer of sonnets, also wrote an awful lot of tragedy and an awful lot of tragic writing. the Renaissance was very influenced by classical study of writers from Rome. They didn't know that much about ancient Greece in the Renaissance, so most of their reflection backwards was looking at the ancient Romans, the writers of ancient Rome, and the philosophers and so on. They developed distinctions between